Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back for his second appearance on the podcast, my friend Emmet Penney. Emmet, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Hey, happy to be here, Robert. Happy to be here another time.
Yes, it was last July, I believe, is when July 13th of last year.
Wow, has it been that long?
It has been. Time flies when you're having fun.
It's been such a great year in between.
Oh, yes. There's nothing happening. Everything's a dry news cycle. There's not much to talk about. So look, I know you're the editor of Grid Brief. You're the host of the Nuclear Barbarians podcast, but guests on this podcast introduce themselves. So you're familiar with that format. So if you don't mind, please give us a short explanation of who you is.
Yeah, so I am a humanities guy with 2 liberal arts degrees that ended up in energy world. Still not quite sure how that happened, but I'm the editor-in-chief of a daily newsletter on energy and energy politics called Grid Brief. Sign up at gridbrief.com/subscribe to get that free in your inbox. I also host 2 podcasts. One's called Nuclear Barbarians, which is about, as you'd expect, nuclear, but from an almost anti-establishment take. And then there is Exhaust, which is sort of a big think podcast that is on why nothing feels possible these days. And just recently, I have been added to, I've received a contributing editorship at Compact Magazine, a new American journal that is sort of a welding together of the populist right and the populist left.
Cool. Okay. Well, there's a ton to talk about. And a joke when I'm giving presentations or whatever that I say, oh, well, there's not much happening in the energy world. Well, there's a crazy amount of stuff that's happening. And you've written 2 recent essays, one in American Affairs, Who Killed Nuclear Energy and How to Revive It, and then another one in Compact where you talked about energy Lysenkoism. So I want to talk about both of these essays because, one, I thought they were really good, and I read them and I thought, damn, I wish I'd written that. But also they apply very directly to something that matters today, May 31st, 2022. This was the designated date for the closure of the Palisades power plant in Michigan, the 811 megawatt nuclear plant in southwestern Michigan. It's been known for years that plant was going to close. It's officially going to close today. It closed a few days early. It closed May 20th because of apparently some mechanical issue. But there's been no effort, no discussion since then by the Department of Energy, by Governor Whitmer in Michigan to reopen the plant or to save it or prevent it from closing at a time when the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator is saying we're so short of electricity, we think they're going to be rolling blackouts. So it's a long introduction to the question here is, how are these, what you've been writing about who killed nuclear and this energy Lysenkoism, they seem to me to be both applicable directly to what we're seeing with this, what I think is just a disastrous and damn near criminal closure of this nuclear plant. Am I giving you too much tea up here? But
No. I think
how do you wind these together?
Yeah, well, I think it's I've got another long form thing coming out from American Affairs on like the grid and how it's been governed over time in America. And so I think if we can just talk about that just a little bit broadly, because I think it's what connects the downfall of nuclear with the fragilization of the grid and this thing I'm calling energy Lysenkoism, which is a sort of political pseudoscience that is extremely hostile to energy.
Yeah. And the demand that we should just use less. Everybody should be happy using less energy.
We should totally repattern society to be about using less energy.
Right. 40 acres and a mule comes to the modern world again.
Right. Well, it's sort of like it is like a lot of things, like a Trojan horse of regime change. Like that's really what it's about. And I think if we take a look at what's happening to the grid, we can notice a lot of that. So the closure of Palisades is one. Nuclear really gets clobbered by a few things in the long form piece that I write about. Some of it is its own fault, not the technology's fault, but the people in charge of managing it. So that's the Atomic Energy Commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the elites who ran utilities, along with those who ran manufacturers. So GE, Westinghouse, et cetera.
Okay.
And then it's the environmental movement, which didn't like nuclear in the post-war era because it didn't like energy abundance, because it saw energy abundance as exacerbating world population, which they thought was going to destroy the world.
Right.
So that's the SparkNotes version of that. So nuclear has been embattled for a long time. But one of the things that happens that's very interesting in the 70s going into the 90s is that there is this collaboration, let's say, between the sort of Lysenkoist Greens who want less energy and, let's say, a more free market oriented libertarianism that is interested in taking apart the frankly corrupt and problematic monopoly utility system.
Right. The deregulationists combining with the green left climate activist that was a kind of convenient marriage of convenience. Is that a fair way to put it?
I think that's a fair way to put it. But I actually, okay. So I want to complicate that a little bit. I think like when we say,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I want to come back to that, but I want to talk about the grid now, or if we can, I want to hold on to that thought, because I think that, but the issue now, it seems to me, is what is going to happen to the grid in the near term, and I want to come back to that, but talk about Palisades first, because that's about grid management, right? That's in the right now term. Why isn't someone stepping in right now to say, hold up?
Yeah, I'll tell you why. And it's because the grid is political. I'm just going to say that outright. There is no like neutral management of the grid.
Right.
Because managing the grid has to do with certain values you have. The values we have.
And vast amounts of money.
And vast amounts of money. So the values we have right now center around this sort of energy Lysenkoism and a sort of hostility to monopolies and consolidated power that has been a part of the American political tradition since the founding. That's, I think, part of what happened to Palisades, is that market conditions were created where reliable generators, whether it be coal or nuclear, in this case it's nuclear, are slowly forced off the grid. You know, Meredith Anquin, who you've had on plenty of times, could do a better job of describing how this happens than me. And they are seen as outmoded relics of a time when big, not small, was beautiful.
Right.
And the mutual interest that we see, and I was about to hop into this from the historical point, is the alleged doing away with market power. That's what this is like. That is a load-bearing term in all of this. Utility big generators have market power over smaller generators like wind and solar, and sometimes natural gas, and that is a big problem because not all power plants are created equally. So if you have things that benefit these big plants, that creates both a market to these people and political problem of who benefits with the money from the grid.
Right.
And who has power over how electricity gets generated.
Right. Okay.
And that's sort of where these things come together. There is this almost
this anti-gigantism, anti-monopolist, anti-big business.
That's right. It has a very Jeffersonian flavor to it.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah. Like if we say so Hamilton, people should read Jay Cost's The Price of Greatness, by the way. Fantastic book on the relationship between Hamilton, Jefferson, but mostly Madison, his protege. Because you start to see these themes play out over time, where I think Hamilton really wanted to spot weld elite interest to the interests of the state to really bolster and solidify America. And when the War of 1812 happened, it really seemed that like Hamilton had the right ideas. And if we look at the post-war electric utility system, it really has all of the benefits and defects of Hamilton's vision, where it does help the national interest to have these monopolies that, as you wrote in your book, you know, I quote you at length in the American Affairs piece on this, really improve the American quality of life.
Right.
You know, it is hard to discount the impact that this has positively on the citizenry of this country. But at the same time, it has all of the elite self-interest, laziness, corruption problems that come with that. And I think I've been very, very hard on the green movement and very, very hard on the free market movement. I would like to be a little bit more sympathetic to them and say that their political concerns were legitimate and that the idea about who runs and who benefits from the grid is the real like sub rosa debate that we are having without knowing that we're having it.
Right. Okay. Go ahead.
So one of the main concerns that's going to come out of these movements are what to do about climate change. Now, their response to how to handle climate change seems to be to reduce human energy use,
Right.
specifically American energy use.
Right.
They don't care about the free rider problem of what happens if the developing world still uses coal. That's not what it's about. Understandably, in a way, because this is what they can have control over,
Okay.
right? Like they're
Right.
acting where they
This is
can
a
actually
policy
vote.
button they know they can push and potentially win at, right? That they have chosen
Yes.
these battles. And I'm talking about the NGO activist groups, the climate activists. They know these are buttons that the policy buttons that they can push and find a sympathetic hearing in the legislatures, whether it's state legislature or in Congress, right? That, oh, well, smaller is beautiful and we're dispatchable and no zero carbon, renewable. All of these things are appealing to a policymaker. Is that, am I following along
Yeah, yeah,
correctly?
who has a
Yeah.
specific, like, basically moral vision for the country,
Uh-huh.
and another
Instead of
moral
instead
vision,
of the big monopolist utilities in the spirit of Insol and
as some of our mutual friends or people we know in our same orbit, the guys at Jacobin, Matt Huber and Fred Stafford and Edgardo in Canada would say, like, a public governance thing.
right.
That's in
Right.
the running too. It doesn't really have a real political constituency here in
Yeah.
America. It's just not big enough. But like that is another way we could do this. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm saying that that's, if we start to look at these as competing visions of what America is supposed to be, how this country is supposed to be shaped, and what industrial makeup the nation is supposed to have, I think it becomes a little bit clearer what's going on and why something like Palisades closes. Because it's not ultimately about union jobs for them. It's not really about energy abundance or whatever. They don't care about that. It is really about, can I get my thing built and the other things to go offline in service of the vision that I have? And there are contradictions within that, as we breathlessly point out all the time.
Right.
Nuclear emits no carbon. It is incredibly energy dense. But again, there's this path dependency from the post-war movement that is entirely hostile to a big energy abundant society. And at this point, it's sort of become like this negative feedback loop of constricting energy supply. So you just interviewed Alex Epstein. His book is fantastic on this. I'm making my way through it very slowly. And there's also a lot of money to be made.
Right.
For now. Right. Like that might be coming to an end, by the way. Like a lot of the economics of this stuff are sort of blowing up in the face of harder realities, or the hard school of history.
And the production tax credits is expired. The investment tax credit is slated to
be mineral market's crazy.
The price of steel, the price of every kind of commodity into these machinery, these machines and solar panels is skyrocketing. I mean, the solar and wind industries are in crisis.
Oh, they're
now.
shitting their pants. Yeah. Oh, yeah. If you like a month ago, I covered some reporting on a conference that like Siemens Gamesa and like all these people had, and in the wind industry, and they were like, yeah, we have no idea what to do. They're like, this is really bleak. The solar people are freaking out because of the auction tariff and because of the mineral prices and the polysilicon problems in China.
Right.
So they're going through the crisis that the monopoly utilities went through in the 70s, basically. I think that's my personal opinion.
So, and back to Palisades, then it becomes this, this critically important plant, 800 megawatts, 811 megawatts, base load capacity, just goes off, and there's no hue and cry from the political class. There's no objections from the most ardent of the climate activists. Nothing, as I wrote in my piece in The Hill on Sunday, nothing from John Kerry, who's called this repeatedly, climate as an existential crisis. What the hell? I mean, is this? But does it go back then to the concept of the grid, and no one is responsible for it? Then, because this is what you've written about a lot, and this idea of the grid as the commons is this most democratic network that we have, and yet it's it's like being fragilized, and no one gives a thin damn about the whole thing. It's incredible to me.
So part of that, I think, is what we see with the sort of pastoral vision for soft energy that comes out of Anne-Marie Lovins, and with the sort of Paul Joskow is sort of the titan of re-regulation theory that comes out of the 80s.
Right. Yeah.
Now, he and Lovins hate each other, by the way.
Yes.
Like
yes,
there's a fantastic series of op-eds between them from, I think, the 80s or 90s, where Joskow basically calls him a Lysenkoist. He's like, nobody knows what a negawatt is. That's not a real thing. But again, you can see that these become twin ambitions because they have the same enemy and because they have a similar instinct, which is to depoliticize the grid from utilities having market power and political power because of that. Right.
Yeah.
And so that looks like that on the market end. And then from the centralized, I would say, like heavy industry of the early modern era in the pastoral vision. And so it's like Eden on the green side, right? We need to depoliticize it so that we can just have this harmonious relationship with nature. And then a very eerily similar, almost cybernetic idea of market equilibrium that comes out of the re-regulation movement. And the consonance between these things shouldn't be too surprising when we remember that the early Silicon Valley innovators, who are all like arch libertarians, and I'm not, shit talking libertarians here, I'm just making a historical point, come out of literally the hippie movement.
Mm-hmm.
Like Whole Earth Catalog,
right? Stuart Brand
has one of the first forums that ever exists on the internet.
Right.
So if we're wondering oh, how do these things go together? That's how. They've actually always been twins, but certain historical shifts have made it harder to see that today.
Well, so let me interrupt, because there you talk about, and I forgot which of your essays, but you talk about this rejection of the man. And so there's this idea that what I'm hearing you say, and I'm rephrasing it a little bit, is this consonance between the hippie left and the free marketers saying, oh, well, we're just going to stick it to big business, right? And we're going to go that the free marketers are saying, oh, we don't need it. This was the Enron vision, right? We're going to go asset light. We're only going to provide as many watt hours as you need. We don't have to build all this extra stuff. And we're going to deregulate the environment. And that's a faith-based, that we're going to deregulate the grid, deregulate the electricity. And that's a faith-based objective, right? Because the faith in the market's going to cure this. And then the other is the faith-based kind of, oh, well, we're going to heal our relationship with the earth. And somehow they come together, and then we're getting screwed with all these solar panels and wind turbines. Is that a fair summary?
Absolutely. And we can put that in an even broader perspective when we look at things like Kanban production styles, just in time.
Say again. What is? Say that.
Kanban, which is just if we take a look at the rise of things like Toyota in the 80s.
Oh, the Japanese word. Okay, yeah. Okay, I got you.
Just in time. And that makes its way into American management stuff. Barry Lynn has a great book about this called The End of the Line that I read during COVID. I think people should go check it out. It's sort of like he calls in 2008 or something like that, all of the problems that became huge during COVID with supply chains. And sort of this just-in-time theory. And so if we put the grid in a broader context of what happens, it's clear we can see that the shift in the American consensus from the post-war era, which is very like top-down, but also has some very nice benefits for everybody, after it collapses during the 70s, it gets reconstituted with different values. And one of the things that's interesting about right now is that that happened almost imperceptibly. People always invoke the New Deal or these things that have happened before in the post-war era and say, almost, why can't we go back? Or why can't we do that?
Back to the 50s or the 60s, the high growth, income's growing, energy consumption is growing, electricity demand is growing double digits a year.
When so many firms aren't even structured that way anymore. Nobody who runs our political bodies sees the state as something that should do that. There has been a huge shedding of institutional knowledge for things like public governance or whatever would make that happen. It has been radically reworked over the last 40 years, and the grid is a part of that story.
And no one's responsible.
Right? Because that's the political evacuation that is trying to, like, as soon as somebody's responsible, they have authority, right? Like if you're a parent, you are responsible for your child. Right. You have authority over your child. You're a teacher. It goes the same way in the classroom, right? If you're a CEO, you have authority and responsibility over what happens in your company.
But without accountability, the thing just falls apart. The kid doesn't wear clothes. The kid does always want, the kid poops in the bed. But here that was the takeaway for me after the Texas blackouts was everybody standing around saying, well, it's not my fault. Oh, well, it's not my fault. It's the market. Oh, well, the buck doesn't stop anywhere. But that seems to me the same thing what we're seeing with Palisades is, well, Entergy owned it, and so Entergy wants to close it. Well, they'll just close it instead of a muscular government coming in and saying, no, damn it, we need this for reliability, for resilience and affordability, particularly at a time when we're short generation across the entire Midwest. And that's the part I just find it so incredibly aggravating and disappointing and inexplicable, truly. I mean, just, and like quote Lily Tomlin, no matter how cynical I get, I can't keep up. You're letting this happen now? Really? You're letting it happen now? I mean, it's just incredible to me.
Well, I think, one of the deep ironies of the re-regulation movement is that it basically hands the reins over to the federal government at the end of the day.
The re-regulation movement that you brought this is something we haven't talked about yet. This is what?
So this is like, the reworking of the grid. I'm talking re-regulation specifically.
Okay, right. Yeah. Okay. What we need to see happen, I think, is clear. But is that where you're going?
When they re-regulate in the 90s, I said the fatal irony is that they handed over to the federal government. That's FERC.
Right.
And FERC has its own weird mandates. And as I've covered in Grid Brief, I think really has, not to be in a conspiratorial way, but they have their own political motivations that inform how they see grid governance that sometimes collaborates with and sometimes butts up against their mandate and abilities as a regulator.
Right.
So what ended up as this dream of like no authority has instead become a jobs program for lawyers and bureaucrats who work at the federal level to try to massage the rules in the favor of what they're clients. Doing. Yeah. And right. Or what they're doing as people, I said that Glick, who's getting re-upped for the head of FERC by Biden, used to work for Iberdrola, now Avangrid, these giants. There was no mention of that.
The Spanish company that has been proposed many wind projects and is proposing offshore wind, and it was rejected roundly in numerous communities in the eastern U.S., including, I believe, Vermont. They had a referendum and they got spanked. I mean, it was 60-40 or something like that. But Iberdrola, Avangrid, yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, totally. So I think, look, like somebody might say, well, when you get to regulation that big, you're going to have a little bit of a revolving door because people need to be familiar with the industry. And I would say, like, fair enough. But one of the things that bothers me is the lip service paid to things like reliability under the auspices of FERC's neutrality, while they undermine things like the MOPR program in ISO New England, which they just did.
Right.
In 2 years, they'll be done with it. So they sort of say on the one hand, like, we really do need a reliability protocol, but it needs to respect state sovereignty so that people can do their renewables programs that I like so much without any interruption. And we'll figure out what that means. But in the meantime, we're going to get rid of the one tool we have for maintaining certain levels of reliability. And that's how this game gets played bureaucratically, where it can appear like it has these neutral, higher, noble aims, and then on the other hand, it is actually Trojan horsing like what is actually desired by these people,
and further reducing reliability. So just another side note: use MOPR, the minimum offer price rule.
That's right.
In ISO New England, which was essentially saying that if you're an electricity generator, you can't bid in a price that's too low. Because it hurts. It hurts the generators that have to be available to assure reliability. It's a complex thing. Have I stated it pretty closely?
Yeah, and I would just add one thing. It happens in the forward capacity market.
Okay.
Rather than like the 5-minute bids or whatever. Yeah. And that's where renewables really crush because they can go negative, no problem, and sort of force other plants out. Again, people can go consult Meredith's work for that. But the forward capacity market is supposed to be this thing that can guarantee reliability when you're going to need it most, winter and summer generally. Right. And that's how a lot of these traditional power plants make their money is they say, when it gets really peaky in the hot summer and the cold winter, which does happen in New England. I've lived there a couple times.
Yeah, right.
You're
going to need us, but you got to pay for us.
We can guarantee this amount of capacity. And you can never do nameplate. You can only do a proportion of that. But the thing about dispatchable power plants is that you can hit pretty close to what nameplate's going to be. Wind, even if you say like, well, on average, they're going to hit like 15%, it's not just that it's, like intermittency doesn't just mean that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It also means that it's not dispatchable, which means you can't call on it to work when you need it.
Right.
And so that's how you can see where there's a reliability angle to it, and exactly why people would say, hey, that's market power tilted in these bigger guys' favor. My wind, solar, whatever should be able to bid in at whatever the hell I want. And the game shouldn't be shifted because that just seems like a handout to major utilities.
Right. So the closure of Palisades is just another example of this degradation of the grid that's happening, and it's happening tomorrow. The other part that's remarkable is exactly 13 months after the closure of the Indian Point, the final reactor at Indian Point, reactor 3 at Indian Point, which was also owned by Entergy, which was also in a state, New York, where they were short generation, and now they're even more. Now they're having even downstate anyway. They're short generation. They're already looking at incredible big increases in electricity prices because they became so much more reliant on natural gas. But it just is disheartening to see this because there just seems to be no awareness, no urgency in the political class to save what is clearly one of our most valuable assets in all of society. I say these reactors are maybe the most valuable physical infrastructure assets that we own and I'm saying we, the people we here, but how is it this one corporation, New Orleans, is able to shut this down and nobody says boo about it? I mean, it just truly is remarkable.
Yeah, so I'm going to get weird for a second here.
Go ahead. Weirder.
Yeah, I'm generally kind of weird. So when we look at what happens with sort of the huge uptick in energy density, energy capabilities that happen at
over time.
Yeah, and sort of the zenith of modernity in the 19th century that sort of ends in around the 70s. The rise of post-modernity happens after that. All of these technologies that we're talking about are very new. And so they're very attractive and people want to take care of them. At a certain point, they mature and there are path dependencies put in place that make them hard to change, but that also makes them, let's say, unsexy. And society just starts to assume that they exist. Now, one of the interesting facets of sort of the modern moment is that in its huge energy on-ramp, there is a huge revision, let's say, of what people think reality can give them. And there's this expectation that novelty will always be there and that there is always tomorrow. There's something deeply hopeful about the modern moment in that way. The problem is that we haven't really dispensed with that way of looking at it, but we have all of these modern technologies that need, I would say, a sort of more lowercase c conservative approach to public stewardship that seems in short supply these days, right? It's almost like a victory defeats it moment culturally and ideologically for this infrastructure that we've created. Because you're saying, why isn't any politician caring about the grid? Well, because like most people, they've never had to think about it before because they just assume it exists, that it's like beans in the soup or German efficiency. It's just around,
right?
And that's
so there's no sense of preservation before the old is torn down. And that's the part that I think is, that rhymes with how I've thought about it, is that, we're tearing down all of this and destroying all of this critical infrastructure without something that's going to reliably replace it. No, a prudent company, prudent businessman, prudent person. Oh no, we'll build the new house before we tear the old one down. But now we're tearing the old one down. The new one isn't built yet. With this idea, we'll run it all renewables. Well, prove it to me first, and then we'll tear down the old system. But that's not what we're seeing. And instead, we're retiring these critically important assets on our most important energy network, and with no sensibility about where this is going, and no one in charge or even having a big vision to say, hold up here, this is wrong. And that's the part that I think is most worrisome. And I don't see a cure in the near term.
No, neither do I. So I just think about it this way. PJM is like 100 years old.
Right.
It starts as a power pool thing in the early 20th century.
And this is the RTO for most of the eastern U.S.
Which I live in now because it dips into the northern part of Illinois where I'm at. We'll be one of the only places, by the way, paying lower on bills because of Byron and Dresden. So Shout out to all of our friends who helped save those plants and save me some money.
And you're talking now about the effort that Governor Pritzker made the legislature signed into law a bill that essentially has contract for difference payments to the nuclear operator Exelon in Illinois that keeps the nuclear plants in the state open. That is now just a year later saving consumers a lot of money because they're not having to pay for gas-fired generation.
And because there's sort of like something built into the bill was that they had to pass on the rewards to consumers.
Uh-huh.
And so I thought that was very, very, very smart. So PJM is like 100 years old. That's older than both of us.
Just barely. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. And that means it's going to take a long time to change these things.
Right.
Right. There's an interesting thing that sort of happened in the last like 40 years where it's like we forget that 40 years has passed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It seems strange to say that the jazz age and the beginnings of like punk were almost as far away from each other as we are from the dawn of punk now.
Okay.
Right. That's surprising.
Right.
There's something that seems like just yesterday about the Sex Pistols in a certain way.
And the Dead Kennedys, and the B-52s, right, yeah. Okay.
Right, where it didn't necessarily, I think, feel that way between like Scott Joplin and Johnny Rotten, right? Like, and that's an interesting historical distortion. But I think once we can sort of take that long view, I would hope that it inspires people to dedicate themselves more seriously to trying to figure out how to affect better, more thoughtful governance of these things while respecting how long it is going to take to change it.
And that's the hard part, isn't it? Because we're just short-termers, right? The politicians are elected every 2 years or every 3 years or every 4 years. And it's like, well, what's going to benefit me now? And in fact, I was looking back at the deregulation here in Texas in 1999. George W. Bush had a press conference and said, oh, yeah, we're going to pass bills that's going to make electricity cheaper, right? Well, okay, yeah, you did for a little while. And now look where we are. We're back. Whatever money might have been saved is all going to be paid back because of this massive failure of the grid and the failure of reliability. But let me talk about your essay that was just published in Compact on energy Lysenkoism. I want to read this whole part because I think it's really well written and it lays out what you're saying. You ask, is the energy debate really about energy? 40 years ago, an engineer at General Electric, Bertram Wolfe, asked the same question in the International Atomic Energy Agency Bulletin. Surveying the American scene after the energy crises of the 1970s, he noticed that the debates around energy, specifically whether to use nuclear energy, fossil fuels, and or solar, tended to, quote, obscure the underlying philosophical motivations which shaped the arguments of the leading participants. Wolfe couldn't have known it, but he had just identified what is now the dominant energy paradigm, energy Lysenkoism, which I believe is your term that you've come up with. Named after
just real quick. I borrowed it from a title of one of Chris Kiefer's podcast episodes.
Oh, okay.
Where they were talking about batteries.
Right.
I just supplied it with its content by borrowing very heavily from Wolfe.
Yeah. Amateurs borrow, professionals steal. So steal away.
That's right, Robert.
Named after Trofim Lysenko, the Soviet scientist whose ideologically based rejection of modern genetics, fertilizers, and pesticides led to crop failures and millions dead, energy Lysenkoism tries, like its namesake, to enforce politics and ideology through science. Lysenkoists distort the realities of energy to smuggle degrowth ideology into public policy, creating a paradigm of energy poverty that imperils the poor and working classes. You say energy Lysenkoism rests on four major pillars, three of which Wolfe identified back in the 1980s. The first is what we've been talking about, a general distrust of a society with abundant energy supplies. From the 1960s and 70s up to the present, a parade of activists and elites have warned that a world with too much energy is dangerous for the planet and for humankind. Bill McKibben, Amory Lovins, etc. We should instead, I'm continuing to quote from you, adopt a romantic austerity and elegant frugality, as American energy theorist Amory Lovins has put it. This perspective works in tandem with what Alex Epstein calls the anti-impact framework. In short, the anti-impact framework assumes that any impact on the natural environment is too high a price to pay for an energy infrastructure project. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us to sap the world's energy supply regardless of the consequences. There's a lot there. But follow up on that. What do you mean by sap the world's energy supplies, and what does that mean for the common folks?
Right. So I think we can sort of see that now. One of the things I bring up at the international level that really looks like something like ESG,
Right.
where it is about sort of badgering major investment firms to pull their money out of the fossil fuel industry and put it into something else that is, of course, ironically dependent on fossil fuels being cheap, namely renewables. So when you pull that investment money out, I think a lot of people thought, and interestingly, Michael Schellenberger talked about this on an episode of the Powercast with Alex Epstein, how he thought that ESG was stupid because eventually that money would just be immediately reinvested.
Right.
People would pulled out, other people would see the opportunity. That's not really what happened. A lot of people pulled money out, and as we're finding, no one really put a bunch of money back in. And now we're seeing what happens when fossil fuels become really expensive. And that is the effect, right? Because one of the things that I find profoundly interesting about the degrowth crowd is that they don't appreciate the variety of necessary products we get from refining fossil fuels.
Right.
They are strictly thinking in terms of electricity. They're almost like assume my conclusions and then argue from there, which is that everything needs to be electrified. Right. So we're only going to think about electricity, which totally creates an intentional blind spot around what's going to happen with plastics or all of these other things that we need for society.
So nitrogen, ammonia, fertilizer.
Exactly. So that's sort of what I'm saying. When they sap the world energy supply, really in today, like at this stage in society, that really means trying to undermine people's ability to have access to fossil fuels.
Right.
Nuclear is a very small player in this game, so it works for nuclear as well. But I mean, I think we've all seen that Our World in Data chart that's sort of like, what like energy consumption by type, and it's like 84% fossil fuel.
Sure. Yeah. You go on in the same piece in Compact, you say it is because of energy abundance through roads, fertilizer, electricity, plastics, and more that our world is as radically safe and wealthy as it is. To force us to do less to force us to do with less is tyranny in its most basic form. Tyranny is a strong word, and one that I don't use very often. Why is it correct here?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking about a seminar I did, I think, early last year with Online Great Books, where I sort of moonlight every once in a while and lead a seminar or two on some of the great works of Western civilization. And I had a very fascinating seminar with some students about Aristotle's.
You're a big Plato fan, right? Am I remembering this right?
Yeah, I love reading the classics. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so this one was on Aristotle's.
I don't read Plato. I don't read that stuff.
And one of the things that came up is we had somebody in the class who was very clearly like, I would say like a progressive social democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had one person who is very clearly like a Jeffersonian libertarian. And so they had very different views on property.
Mm-hmm.
And the closer, I wanted to feature that tension between them so that they could better see each other's perspective and so that we could better understand what Aristotle had to say about property and the regime. Now, I'm not going to go through what he says about it here, only to say that regimes tend to be structured around property, structured around the idea of physical goods that people can own.
And who controls them.
And who controls them. And that's why I said it's tyranny in its most basic form, right? Who's a slave and who isn't is a question of property.
Well, when you say that, it's really interesting because I see this, and I spend a lot of time, as I've written, but I spend a lot of time in rural America. I mean, I meet farmers all the time, right? Because I'm talking to electric cooperatives, and they contact, and a lot of people contact me. They're doing, they're fighting a wind or solar project, and they're farmers, and many of them women. But what I see is this same idea about who controls it, right? And what I see when it comes to the wind and solar thing that follows on what you're talking about this idea of the pastoral nature and the rest of it, is this is a massive land grab by some incredibly powerful interests that are all in the big cities, and they're just going to stick it to the rural people, right? And the rural people are sitting out there saying, wait a minute, no, wait, we don't want this. But there's so much money and media interest and so much political power behind the big businesses coming to control rural land that these people are at a huge disadvantage. And I'm just adding that because what you're talking about is this idea about control and tyranny that around a concept, right, of danger around climate or the right acting or religious fervor around renewables, and just because it's renewables playing out in the physical world that I see all the time now myself.
Yeah, and I think that that's where we are. Like, I really hope one of my goals when I write pieces like this is to bring like a political, philosophical, and maybe cultural valence to what are generally seen as technical policy problems right now.
Mm.
And I think that I would hope that if I do my job right, it helps to enrich and historically deepen the discussion so that we can have a democratic debate about what we want as a society. Now, I point out in the piece that it's not just a debate, it's also a political fight. Democracies have a level of agonism in them about who gets to do what, and that level of faction is ventilated by the Constitution and the ability to vote and be represented. So I really want there to be a better, more substantive debate that helps inform an actual political fight that is playing out and is largely catering to one side's victory.
Uh-huh.
You know,
And what side? And what side is that?
which is a lot of elite interest against everyday people.
Well, let me follow up on that, because one of the questions I wrote down, and because, well, I'm a fan, right? And I quote your work a lot, and rightly so. What motivates you in this? I mean, you've touched on it some there, but I mean, there's, anger and frustration motivates a lot of what I do. What motivates you in this? Because you clearly put your heart into it. Why do you care so much?
Yeah, well, I think, I have always been interested in fairness. I think, and it's really funny. Like when we were moving, my wife and I found this journal my parents took of me from when I was a toddler, and it is so
And I'm
obvious.
just going to interrupt you. You just moved from Los Angeles to Chicago, so
Chicago,
you're giving the background
Yes.
here, and
Right.
you just arrived in Chicago.
We just arrived in Chicago, and we're going through it. It's like pretty clear that I've always had some of the same core concerns, like things like fairness, like trying to make sure that everybody gets a little bit of a share and things like that, and also some of the same defects, which I'm not going to get into publicly because I would like everybody to see me as amazing, and
Even your wife,
yeah, even my wife,
especially your wife.
yeah, exactly. And so I think part of it's that. I think it's part of just sort of like who I am. And I also think that got really patterned by the institutions I grew up in, especially the Jesuit high school I went to here in Chicago, St. Ignatius College Prep, which was, its slogan was men and women for others and ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God. So everything you did, they really drilled it into you that you wanted to be thinking of others and God before yourself. And I think that that's a big part of what informs my patriotism. I see what I'm doing as a contribution to civic life, which I take very, very seriously. That is one of the reasons why I love reading Plato, because the dialogues take civic life very seriously by the fact that they're in the dialogue form about fundamental questions of the political regime. And I am very worried about the country that I live in and the direction that it's going. And I would hope that I could have some sort of small, but in the long run, positive impact on what happens to it by bringing people who would otherwise not be interested or not even know about problems with grid governance into an understanding of what is at stake with our most important infrastructure here.
That rhymes with what my motivation, that these things are too important to be ignored, and they're too important for me to just not say my piece, and to point out with using as much math and physics as people can bear about saying, well, what's really going on here. But let me shift and talk about your piece in it's called Who Killed Nuclear and What We Can Do to Save It, if I think I've got the rest of it correct. And this was what you published in American Affairs just in the last few days. And you talk about a recent meeting of the MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, the other RTO, which is like ERCOT, or like we talked about ISO New England, and also PJM. And you quote one of the MISO's vice presidents, who put the problem this way: we're seeing less predictable dispatchable generation. This is MISO speaking. We're seeing retirements. We're seeing forced outage rates increase in those assets we depend on to manage that increasing variability and volatility. So while volatility is increasing, our ability to deal with it is decreasing simultaneously. And then that's the end quote. And then you say, in other words, the all renewables decarbonization plan adds volatility to energy portfolios, forces out reliable electricity generators like Palisades. You didn't put this in your piece. and destabilizes the grid. And by making us more reliant on weather-dependent energy, the environmental movement has made us more vulnerable to the weather patterns they warn climate change creates. Moreover, renewables have reversed their decarbonization aims by locking in natural gas and coal while making America more dependent on the cheap coal China uses to make solar panels. Our current energy and food crises can be directly linked to the West's pursuit of fashionable green policies. Many of these problems are features, not bugs. And here's the concluding line. The all renewables dream was never about reducing greenhouse gases, but about entrenching energy poverty to halt population growth so as to spare the environment. This is similar to what you wrote in the energy Lysenkoism piece, but still it's about this idea, not just the romanticization of poverty, but the forced energy poverty that will come with these misaimed dreams. I guess my question that I wrote here is, why is energy entrenching poverty so attractive? I mean, what is it about that these people find? I mean, Bill McKibben has said, well, we need to use 1/20th of the energy we're using. And I'm thinking, well, you first, mister. Why would I need to do that?
That's so crazy. I don't even think people maybe he does really understand what that means. Like in a daily phenomenological level, like what that would mean for people. If he does, then he's basically, I don't use this term lightly, Hitlerian in a certain sense, in his outlook of what should happen to other people.
Mm. But these are the commonalities between, oh, well, we're just going to solve all this with efficiency. Everyone's going to use less, and that everyone's going to be happier. Well, no, if what we're seeing is more extreme weather and more people coming out of poverty, we're going to need a whole lot more energy, not less. Oh, yeah. And then fundamental misreading of where we are.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you get so lean you're starving. You know, like that's part of what's happening here. So to answer your question, like what is so attractive about this? I'm very split because of my interest in the ancients. I'm very much a believer in things like tradition, Christian. I understand this longing for times before and wanting a greater communion with them than what seems readily available in a highly industrialized, highly digitalized society. I think there's a deep longing there. So if we want to put sort of maybe a more emotionally relatable cant on what these people desire, if we want to be sympathetic to them at a political level, I think there is a fairly deep and important question about who controls what at the heart of what they're saying.
Right.
And then I think they sort of make the wrong conclusions from that based on a pastoral romanticism that has more or less been a part of elite psychology for centuries.
Right. Yeah.
And that's sort of what I think is happening here. Like in a way, our times aren't so unique that we have reached escape velocity from some of these older historical trends of people who have a lot saying, oh, I wish we could go back.
Right. This is the start of Silent Spring, right? Where Rachel Carson says, well, there was a time when humans lived in harmony with nature, right? And it's in Thoreau as well. And you see it in a lot of these other kind of canonical works, right, in American literature about this same idea of, oh, well, if only we go back to the farm. Well, the farm's hard work, and a lot of people don't want to live on the farm, and there's a reason why people moved off, and one of them was electrification, right? That once we made that hard work, we obviated the need for it with better power and energy networks. People moved away because there were other things they could do that were more fulfilling and more valuable to the society.
Yes. Yeah. So let's add like another element to this that I think can help illuminate why people might believe what they believe about returning. So if we really situate the post-war environmental movement in the Cold War and the relationship between things like nuclear civilian tech and military tech, which is you really can't separate historically in America. You just can't. Like, I know a lot of people want to, but I don't think that's honest. And you take a look at the type of command and control society that gets built during the Cold War and the way in which it was very much an insider's game and seemed to almost conspire against the American people. A lot of them felt, there are varying degrees of truth of this. You can start to see, and that's why I use the phrase "the man" in the nuclear piece,
Right.
that these things sort of all come together around like one big managerial conspiracy against democratic control. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that is not entirely incorrect. Right. If we take a look at, I lived in New Mexico for a while. I can tell you that the relationship between Southern New Mexico and the United States government, and especially nuclear tech, is hostile, and probably for a good reason, given their experience with all the testing and all the, frankly, like irresponsible stuff that happened down there.
Right.
And
so is the suspicion of gigantism, the suspicion of big government, the suspicion of big business, that all these things coalesce around this soft path that Amory Lovins has been touting now for 50 years, and that we're going to disaggregate all of this. But it also rhymes exactly with the disintermediation that was pushed by Enron. We're going to flatten the whole thing, right? We're going to
exactly. And Ralph Kavanaugh actually debated Paul Joskow about what re-regulation was supposed to look like, and he was like, "Hey, man, literally do whatever you want as long as I get to keep all my green demand response stuff and all of my conservation stuff. I know you can't technically put a price on those things, but that's sort of the point. They're priceless. And so if we can structure the California market to assume certain elements of the green ideology, then I'm fine with electricity spot market." And that is, in a large way, what really happens in California in the 90s, which everybody uses as a template until it goes way south after 2000, 2002.
And it's only getting worse. With more generation, the number of standby generators in the region has just skyrocketed.
Yeah. Oh, and I should clarify, by the way, Ralph Kavanaugh was a lawyer for the NRDC, is still trying to close Diablo Canyon,
right.
Won the Supreme Court case for the NRDC that put in California's nuclear moratorium.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that.
That's how he cut his teeth. Yeah. Yeah. That was 1983, I want to believe, that he pulled that off.
40 years, right. And he's been at NRDC since then.
And he's still publishing op-eds, like trying to dunk on Ted Nordhaus, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And that the closure of Diablo Canyon, claiming again that the closure of Diablo Canyon is the right move, despite the fact that it supplies 6 to 10% or something like that of California, the entire generation of electricity in California. Quick station break. My guest is Emmet Penney. He's a friend of mine. I'm proud to call him a friend of mine. We haven't met in person yet. We're going to make that happen. Meyer is writing quite a lot. His newsletter is Grid Brief. You can find that at gridbrief.com. He's also the host of the Nuclear Barbarians podcast and the Exhaust podcast, Exhaust podcast. Hey, so we're both friends. We're speaking about, who are our mutual, who we like and who we don't like. We both have a tremendous regard for Meredith Angwin and her book, Shorting the Grid. I'm an unabashed fan. She's been on the podcast as much as anyone. Why do you think, I'm asking because I have my own ideas, why has she had such traction? What is it that about Meredith and what she's brought to this debate has brought her at age now 77, this kind of a burst of, I would call it fame and notoriety and acclaim for which, what void did she fill? Why has she had such a powerful impact on these debates?
Well, I think, first of all, that it's timely, right? Like nothing beats good timing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that is so much of everything. And so I think she published the book at the right time because, you know what happens to ERCOT pretty soon after she releases that book.
She publishes in fall of 2020, and then February we have the winter storm Uri, and
that's
700 people die, and 150 billion or so is lost, and that we're going to be securitizing that debt now, and we're going to be paying for it forever.
That's right. So I think the other part of it is that she is the sunlight on the grid. I mean, look, I do this for a living now. This has become my life's work, is trying to report on this stuff. I don't have a technical background. It is very difficult for me to learn these things. I will never have the level of proficiency that someone like Mark Nelson or Meredith Angwin has. That's just never going to happen in my life.
Right.
Now, what she has done is provided people like me with an access point to figure out how to communicate about these things.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you read any of the trade publications, which I do now every day, about how this works, is I feel like there's an episode of The Simpsons where somebody says something and Lisa Simpson says, "I know what those words mean, but not in that order." And like that's how a lot of this stuff makes me feel.
Right. That's good.
And so it's a huge level up. Like it takes her 10 years to write that book.
Right.
I mean, I'm rereading it now.
And she published it herself.
And she published it herself, right? So it's a pretty Herculean effort that she's pulled off. So I think that's part of it. I think Meredith is also very fair in her responses to people.
Mm-hmm.
I also think she's not a doormat, which is very inspiring.
Right.
And I think that she is the right combination of humble and skeptical
mm-hmm.
that gives her an aura of an integrity that I believe she's earned.
Yeah. Yeah. I that's how I'd put it. Yeah. She's earned her spot. Right. And,
yeah, totally.
And that unimpeachable in terms of, well, okay, yeah, she's a grandmother. She's 77, but she's just doing this because she cares. It's not because she's working for someone else. This is because this is what she's about. And that's the other part that I think is so you just can't acquire genuine, right? You can't buy genuine, and
no,
you can't buy authentic. And that's something that matters to me a lot. I mean, when I think about what I publish, what I do, is it authentic? Is it me? Is it my thing? Right. And it's one reason why my, I'm not bragging, but in my newsletter, I put it out every Friday. People respond to the bird stuff as much as they do anything else, right? Because I write about birds.
I love the bird stuff.
I'm a birder, right? And and it just wasn't a lark, but it was part of what informs who I am, right? And has for 30 years. And so people respond to that, I think. But so what you talk about the elites, and we talked about Meredith, who we both admire, but we've also taken shots, and rightly so, at what you talk about. Something we talked about last year on the phone, and I asked in our previous interview a year ago now. You said when a country's elites and financial institutions undermine the material structures that provide them their status, a country can be said to be in decline. I'm bullish on the U.S. I mean, amidst all these problems that we have, and I don't like to think about America in decline, but I can also see it. The shooting in Uvalde, these other things, these random acts of just incredible mass violence, and the people who are not just unemployed, but in many cases unemployable, and they live on the fringe. And I see this, and it's heart-wrenching. But what I see this role of the elites and the rest in this decline of the grid. But you've talked about the financial institutions. We talked about BlackRock and ESG. What role do the academics play here? Because I think that we both have tracked other, elite academics who put out fancy spreadsheets. They testify before Congress. They publish in the New York Times and elsewhere. Oh, we can all do this if only we had the political will. What role of culpability do the elite academics have in this?
Oh, I think a very big role. I was thinking the other day, there's this fantastic interview between a British journalist and Noam Chomsky, I think the 80s. And he's sort of going after Chomsky for his whole conspiracy theory about manufacturing consent and things like that. Mm-hmm. He says, I can publish what I want. My editors let me, I'm allowed to disagree or whatever. And I believe everything that I'm telling you right now. And Chomsky says, I have no doubt that you believe everything you're telling me right now. I'm just saying that if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
Right. Where you stand depends on where you sit. That's the old axiom, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that that's sort of what's happening here. And
that academics are rewarded for taking this certain position around the all renewable mirage and the rest of it, that this gains them stature. Is that where you're going? Or
yes, exactly. So I think that that's part of it. There's also, I don't know what the money looks like, so I can't speculate on that. But I will say, if we want to look at it as a system, you can learn a lot from Twitter, and you can learn a lot by who follows who.
A lot of it bad.
A lot of it bad. Who follows who retweets who, and who
right.
has certain conversations. And one of the things that I've realized is that there seems to be this network, again, non-conspiratorial, it's just people working on a common project, as you and I and our friends are working on our own common project, again,
right.
not a conspiracy, of academics, regulators, regulatory alumni, and NGOs that all sort of train up the next generation of people who are going to fight for their idea of what the grid should look like.
Right.
And so I think that while there is I would say, sort of, clearing the path ideologically for these goals that happens for academics, and that's part of their power. There is also, I would say, like this intergenerational patronage system that trains people up to continue forwarding these views in society.
The patronage system, right, within academia and the NGOs, right, because and government, because there is
and policy,
right, that my friend Chuck Spinney called it the self-licking ice cream cone, right? That the money flows around the people, around the jobs, the revolving door, that there is a system where it just perpetuates itself. That there's, you call it, I think patronage system. That sounds right to me.
Yeah, there's this sort of dissident right-wing thinker who I don't like a lot of the time, but he has a great phrase for this called the cathedral. And that is sort of the intellectual cultural edifice that creates the ideological prism through which a lot of us experience our society.
And who is that? Who's the writer?
And so that's going to be academics. It's going to be, I've just moved out of LA, so I can tell you that Hollywood is a big part of that as well.
So who coined this term, the cathedral?
Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin.
Oh, okay.
And I think what he really captures of it is that it feels almost spontaneously generated. Gore Vidal put it this way: there's no conspiracy of the elites because there doesn't need to be one.
Because they know what you're supposed to say.
Yeah, well, and they all know each other. They all come up in these institutions.
Right,
it's just the way it is. And hey, he would know that dude was wealthy as hell.
Right.
He had a nice home on the Amalfi Coast.
I met him once at the Texas Book Festival. It's a different story, but that's But there doesn't need to be one. Just what pops into mind is I'm going to interview Batya Ungar Sargon, who wrote a really interesting book called Bad News, how woke culture in journalism in media is corrupting America, something like that. But Bad News. And her take was, her fundamental point is that the media, the big media outlets are run by elites, and that they don't need to be told what they're supposed to write, but they write for the other elites, right? And their audience is, and she contrasts it very well, I think, with the early days of the newspaper business, including Joseph Pulitzer, who made his fortune selling, penny broadsheets, right? That this was this was a journalism for the masses, for the working class, and that's not the case anymore.
No, I think the big moment on that is actually Watergate. I think that Watergate's this great moment of investigative journalism. It is also, I think, what brings a lot of people who come from Ivy League pedigree into journalism that want to be the intrepid investigative hero. Mm-hmm. Because it's not like everyone loved working class journalists historically.
Yeah. Right.
That was not your job to be loved and vaunted the way you are if you're a certain type of journalist now. Right? I think we can all remember sort of the insane valorization of the press that happens post 2016.
Right.
Like far and beyond any earned merit, which isn't to say that the press isn't important and there aren't good journalists.
But let me ask you, you said post 2016?
Yeah.
The valorization of journalism after what happened in 2016. I'm not following you there.
Trump got elected.
Oh, okay. Right. Yeah. Right. That this was right. And that the media, the big media outlets had to take down Trump because he wasn't part of that elite system. Is that what?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. I mean, allegedly. I have my own thoughts about
I got you.
Who he actually is and stuff like that. But I'm not a fan. But I think that that's a huge cultural moment for the U.S. And I think that the press plays a huge, huge role. I mean, your experiences with what happens with NPR journalists, right? A state organ, there's a really weird, that's energy Lysenkoism at its purest. That's Pravda level.
Right. But then this anti-Trumpism, right? Oh, and how all these stupid, bumpkins out in the country, they just don't know what's good for them, was the gist of that whole thing, which was written by a journalist from San Francisco, right? never went to Worth County, Iowa, never talked to the board supervisor in Madison County. That wasn't, that just doesn't fit the story that I'm planning to do, regardless of what the facts are.
Yeah. I mean, hey, look, I'm grateful every day of my life that my first few years out of college, I spent dead broke in Tallahassee, Florida. That was a huge education in my own uptight Northern liberal assumptions that really helped me see another side and appreciate people that I just assumed, frankly, because I was like a Daily Show liberal, were stupid and didn't know what was good for them.
Yeah.
And I think once you go out there and meet with people who come from those parts of the country and live and work with them, in my case, I no longer see myself as like this person apart from them. We have disagreements. That's natural in a society. I mean,
Right.
come on. That's in Federalist 10 in the Federalist Papers. Faction is just going to arise because they're competing visions and interests.
Right.
But,
But the voters who live in the trailer park don't have the stroke that the ones that do on the Upper West Side, or that they're not going, or they're not voting at all. But their economic interests are their everyday thought. I mean, these are parts of how am I going to buy enough gasoline to get to work, and these other things that are front and center for their daily budgets that aren't what you consider, are not going to be the front page topics in the New York Times because it doesn't fit that narrative.
No, and I should also say that a lot of times those topics don't make it onto Fox News either.
Yeah, of course.
Like that's another important part. Like I think I want to sort of do justice to both sides here and say that like this isn't me making this like covert case for everybody to vote Republican. What I'm really saying is that there is, and my socialist friends point this out all the time, a total atrophy of any sort of class perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's right on the money, right on the dot.
Yeah.
That there's a misunderstanding, and I see it, in rural America. I mean, rural America tends to be poorer, and then urban America is just a fact, and that's what we see.
Right, and it's strange to me that one of the things that's interesting to me about our intellectual landscape today is that people like Mike Lind seem so weird.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I hear him go on podcasts, I'm a fan of his work. I love The New Class War. I think everyone should read it. But he's basically like, I'm a New Deal Democrat.
Yeah. Yeah.
And still, even if he gets published in New Republic or whatever, like he's mostly thought of as this like conservative populist thinker.
Right.
I think that should tell us something about the assumptions that are more common today than it does tell us about someone like Mike Lind.
So that yesterday's New Dealer is now what?
An arch conservative.
An arch conservative who wants
like a nationalist, like a right-wing nationalist, like that's how it's often seen.
Yeah, but let's bring this back to the grid, because I think that it's critical to understand what the Public Utility Holding Company Act of 1935 and the Rural Electrification Act of 1936, those were about diffusion of political and economic power, right? And it was a different vision for what the grid was or what the grid should be. But it was a democratization of the grid.
That's right.
So I see that as a nationalism, but not necessarily as conserving resources, right? But it was, I don't know how, I think it's an interesting point that you make, but where would New Dealers like LBJ in the 30s or Burton Wheeler or George Norris or FDR even, where would they fit in today's political spectrum? I'm asking that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the dark truth is that a lot of them would be seen as nationalists. Like, look, I mean, a lot of these guys were like more culturally conservative than like any standard Democrat we have in office today, right? Like, why are people pissed at Joe Manchin all the time? It's because he's like sort of a culturally conservative Democrat, also physically conservative,
right,
but like,
right.
People really resent that. And I think
that he has so much, and that he has so much power, and he's in a swing state that, that is kind of a bellwether for the rest of the country.
And it's, yeah, exactly. Well, the other thing too is that it's a small rural state filled with, ignorant yokels who don't know what's good for them.
Right.
Right. That's the major resentment there.
You think so?
One guy that represents them can just like he's just like plopping lemons and progressive milk all the time. I think that probably drives them insane that anybody from that part of the country can do that much to undermine the coastal agenda for certain things. There was a letter in the Wall Street Journal today, in fact, that said almost that very thing, that Manchin, that these elites when it comes to the Build Back Better, that they just don't get it, but that Manchin, who got a football scholarship to West Virginia University, gets it, right? They don't, right? That if they'd passed the Build Back Better Act, it would have been incredibly inflationary, bad for the country. And Manchin understood that, but the elites who were, pushing this, they didn't care, right? It wasn't going to be a problem for them. No, absolutely not. And that's not to say I agree with everything Manchin says.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Far from it, right? I just want to point out the dynamic. So, one of the reasons why I was so thrilled to take on the contributing editorship at Compact was because Compact to me, I mean, it is what it says in its title. It's a compact between a culturally conservative populist right and a class-oriented socialist left. And it is understanding that there needs to be some sort of compact, some sort of relationship between these two dissident tendencies to restore, I would say, a class perspective that is more reflective of the diversity of the American way of life rather than what gets refracted through the cathedral.
Yeah, I like that because I think it's just fundamentally what I hear when you say that is that we need more attention on the working class and what are the things that matter to them, and energy prices are one of the main ones.
And
right?
that's part of why I got into this whole game. Like I have been a fan of the New Deal and FDR since I was a little kid. I remember at the Thomas Alva Edison Elementary Library, checking out a big picture book on FDR. I was very interested in that sort of like, what about the little guy type of thing from a young age.
Yeah.
And I just haven't let go of that, and I think we need way more of that than we've got. Energy is a huge part of that.
Yeah. And that was what Sam Rayburn's famous line, I want my people out of the dark and I want my people out of the mud. And
that's right.
I want power lines and I want roads. And that was fundamental to this guy who was born on a cotton farm in Bonham, Texas, a few miles from the Red River. So a couple of last things, Emmett. We've been talking now for more than an hour. My guest is Emmet Penney. My friend Emmet Penney, I greatly admire his work. You can find more about him at gridbrief.com or on his podcast, Nuclear Barbarians or Exhaust Podcast. So what are you reading now? I know you're a big, great books guy, but what's, I'm looking at the different books on my Václav Smil's. Oh, no, wait a minute. This is one of them that's Making Numbers Count. I've got Václav Smil's new book here. What's on the top of your pile on your desk now? I know you've just moved, but what are you thinking about reading?
Yeah. So I'm rereading Meredith's book for research for this American Affairs piece. It's one of the last books I need to read, to sort of really embark on writing, though I've already written parts of it. I've also been reading this fascinating book called The Machine in the Garden by a historian, sort of a cultural historian, Leo Marx, spelled as in Karl Marx.
The Machine in the Garden.
In the Garden, yeah.
Okay.
He takes a look at sort of the pastoral ideal along with the industrial ideals as they played out in the mid-19th to early 20th centuries in America.
Gotcha.
And he even goes so far back as the founding and canonical writers like Emerson and Rousseau, Thoreau, to sort of like see how Americans have been thinking and talking about industrialism and its relationship to nature. And, Leo Marx has some other essays I've read where I disagree with what he has to say, but he's always fascinating. And he always brings something to light. He reminds me of one of my favorite authors, which is Christopher Lasch. Whose work I'm always just sort of consulting or thinking about in the background, because I think he poses the most diverse challenge to some of my assumptions, especially in writing about energy and industrialism in general. So those are the things I'm looking at, because one of the things I want to do with this piece coming up is, again, sort of give people the cultural and political and historical context to understand how the grid has changed over time.
Right.
And part of that's because I can't do the policy deep dive. I'm just never going to have the acumen where I could actually write something that goes that far into the weeds about it. Right. And the other thing is because I think that's really needed in our conversation. As you and I have been talking about. That type, I really want to contextualize what's going on, because so many people just assume the grid and take it for granted that it needs to be cast in new light.
Right.
So that's what I'm reading. I'm also, slowly, sips here and there, reading Alex Epstein's Fossil Future, which I'm greatly excited about. I've learned a lot from Alex. He's always been generous to me. I appreciate that he has always takes the time to respond to me or talk to me and take me seriously, despite whatever our political alignments are and where they differ. I really respect that in him. And I think he's a super effective communicator.
Yeah.
Like reading something like Fossil Future is like downloading all sorts of new rhetorical techniques into your brain.
Yeah.
And that feels empowering. Yeah. And it's nice to read something in the energy world that feels conversational and empowering. That's a rarity. Yeah. Like I admire Smill's work. I would not describe him as a conversational writer.
No, nor would I.
Like that guy's not churning out airport books. You know?
That's a fair assessment. So, last question then, Emmet. What gives you hope? What makes you optimistic?
What makes me optimistic is the work itself. I don't really actually think in terms of optimism. I try to think in terms of hope, and I try to think of hope in terms of action. So what am I doing today to be a drop in the stream of the future I want to see flow? And that's how I approach writing my newsletter. That's how I approach my research, is I try to cast every day again in a light where it's not necessarily just about me and my desires to intellectually know things or for notoriety. Certainly, as somebody who likes seeing my name in a byline, like every other journalist or writer out there, that's part of it too. But to imagine that I am making a contribution on par with these sometimes forgotten historians and writers that I cite and the works that get shared all over the place.
So the hope is in the work and being able to keep doing the work and doing work that matters.
Right, exactly. And, the amount of out of print books I've read, like on the history of utilities or whatever, and the way that has totally changed the way I think about the grid has also changed the way I've thought about intellectual production, where you never know the way in which you're going to be effective. And that gives me hope for the work being done.
Well, that's a good place to stop. Emmet, thanks again for being on the Power Hungry podcast. It's been great fun. And as I said, you can find Emmet on gridbrief.com or on his podcasts. Look him up. I think you're going to dig his work like I dig it, or I hope you do. So, Emmet, thanks for coming on the podcast.
It was an absolute pleasure to be here, Robert. Thank you so much.
And thanks to all you in podcast land. Tune in for the next episode of the Power Hungry podcast. See you then.